The first time George Alden rode into Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1882, he did not look at a single soul, and not a single soul dared look too long at him. He came in from the South Trail just as the sun was splitting the horizon into burnt orange and pale gold. His horse, a dark bay named Cutter, moving at a slow, deliberate walk that matched the unhurried, heavy silence George carried with him like a second coat. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked as though it had been cut from the same red limestone that jutted out of the Kansas plains. His hat was pulled low, its brim shadowing eyes that were the color of a storm you could see coming from 30 miles out, gray and flat, and giving nothing away. He wore a faded canvas duster, cracked leather gloves, and a revolver at his hip that he had not drawn in a long time, but that everyone who looked at him instinctively understood was not decorative. He had ridden in from the direction of the Kishom Trail, from the long grass and the dust and the years, and he intended only to resupply and move on. That was what he always intended. He had been intending to move on for 6 years now, and so far the moving on was the only thing he was any good at. Caldwell in 1882 was a town that sat on the edge of the Cherokee Strip, right where Kansas pressed itself against Indian territory, and it had all the rough industry of a cattle town at full boil. There were saloons and stock pens and a land office and a dry goods store and a barber who doubled as a dentist. And there were cowboys everywhere, trail-dusted, wind-burned men who came up from Texas with the longhorn herds and spent their wages in the space of a week before turning around and going back south to do it all again. There was a marshal named Ed Harper who was known to be fair and capable, and there was a telegraph office and a small church that had a leaking roof nobody had gotten around to fixing since the previous October, and there were dogs sleeping in the road and chickens that belonged to no one, and the whole place smelled of horses and cattle and wood smoke, and the particular kind of optimism that frontier towns carried even when things were genuinely difficult. George tied Cutter at the rail outside Henley's Dry Goods and pushed inside without reading the notice board that was nailed beside the door. He picked up what he needed: hardtack, dried beans, a new length of rope, a tin of coffee, and set it all on the counter without a word. The man behind the counter, a round-faced fellow named Silas Henley, who was well accustomed to taciturn cowboys, counted up the price and said something vague about the weather, and George set down the exact coins and left. He had not said a kind word to anyone in 6 years. It was not a decision he had made all at once. It had happened the way a river changes course, gradually, then completely. 6 years ago, in the spring of 1876, he had been a different kind of man. He had been 24 years old and working a ranch outside of Abilene with a woman named Clara, who he was going to marry. And there had been a life taking shape around him that he had believed in entirely. Then a fever had come through the county in August of that year, fast and merciless and without preference for the young or the hopeful. And it had taken Clara in the space of 5 days, and it had taken the infant she had been carrying that nobody outside the two of them had known about yet. And it had taken, though George would not have described it this way himself, most of what George Alden had been before it came. He had not stopped working. He had not taken to the bottle in any permanent way. He had not become violent or criminal or anything that the world would have noticed and named. He had simply stopped offering himself to the world in any tender direction. He answered questions with the minimum number of words. He did his work, and he moved on when the work was done. He had spent 6 years on various cattle drives and ranches, always useful, always capable, always a little apart from the other men, in a way that they respected without understanding. He was 30 years old now, and he looked it in the way that men who work outdoors in the American West always look their age and slightly more besides, and he was deeply, thoroughly alone in the manner of someone who has been alone so long that the aloneness has become structural, like a load-bearing wall. He repacked his saddlebags at the rail and was preparing to mount Cutter, and ride west toward whatever the next piece of work would be when he heard the sound of the wagon. It came around the corner from behind the feed store at a pace that was too fast for the street, one of the wheels catching a rut badly and sending the whole rig lurching sideways. The horse pulling it, a gray with a white blaze, clearly exhausted and ill-tempered, threw its head and nearly went to its knees, and the woman holding the reins pulled hard and called out to the animal in a low, steady voice that somehow managed to carry authority without panic, and the gray settled and the wagon did not overturn, though it came genuinely close. George watched all of this with the detached attention of a man who observes things without intending to. The woman brought the wagon to a stop 10 feet from him, set the brake with her foot, and sat for one moment with her eyes closed, her hands still on the reins, clearly collecting herself. She was perhaps 26, with dark brown hair that the wind had pulled halfway out of its pinning, and that she did not seem particularly concerned about. She had a straight, serious face, not humorless, but composed, as if she were accustomed to composing herself under circumstances that required it. She wore a practical gray dress and a cream-colored blouse and driving gloves that had seen real use, and beside her on the wagon seat was a carpet bag and a wooden crate with a piece of oilcloth over it. She opened her eyes, looked at the street, looked at the horse, looked at George and said, "I apologize for the commotion." George did not respond. He set his boot in the stirrup and swung up onto Cutter. "Excuse me," she said. "I wonder if you could tell me where I might find a place called the Grayson lot. I was told it was near the stockyards, but I have been going in what I believe is circles, and I am not entirely confident I am even on the correct street." He looked at her. He looked at the street. He looked at the stockyards, which were visible from where they both were, the long wooden fences and the dust rising above them, and the sound of cattle unmistakable even at this distance. "South end of town," he said, and pointed. 2 words, both of which were geographical facts. She followed the direction of his hand, and then looked back at him with an expression that was plainly relieved and plainly grateful, and something else besides, something that was simply, openly warm in the way of a person who extended warmth naturally and without strategy. "Thank you," she said. "That is genuinely helpful. I've been driving since before sunup, and I am afraid my sense of direction does not improve with fatigue." She smiled at him when she said it, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and carried the brief suggestion that she found herself slightly ridiculous and was willing to share that with a stranger. George Alden looked at that smile and felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not want to examine. He nodded once, turned Cutter, and rode west. He made it about 400 yards before he stopped. He sat on the horse in the middle of the road and stared at the flat Kansas horizon and felt the thing in his chest continue to do whatever it was doing, which was approximately nothing like what he was used to, and which he found profoundly inconvenient. He had been thanked before. People thanked him occasionally. It was a social custom, and he recognized it as such, and he let it pass over him the way wind passes over rock. But she had said more than thank you. She had said it was genuinely helpful. She had said it in a way that implied she was talking specifically to him, to a particular person, not simply discharging an obligation of courtesy. She had said it in a voice that carried, underneath the words, some small and quiet acknowledgement of him as a human being worthy of being addressed as such. And George Alden, who had not said a kind word to anyone in 6 years, and who had, in that same time, become entirely unaccustomed to receiving them in any real measure, did not know how to carry it. He sat with it for a long moment, this small, warm weight of being seen, and he did not know what to do with it, and that scared him in a way that nothing in the last 6 years had managed to scare him, which was considerable because he had been through 2 cattle stampedes, a river crossing that went wrong, and a range fire in the Colorado Territory. He turned Cutter around and rode back toward town. He told himself it was because he needed to ask Henley about whether there was any ranch work to be had in the county. This was also true, but it was not the primary reason, and some unexamined part of George Alden knew that, even if the examined parts were busy pretending otherwise. The Grayson lot, as it turned out, was a piece of property at the south end of Caldwell that had belonged to a man named William Grayson who had died the previous winter of pneumonia, leaving behind a small house, a modest piece of land, and apparently, the woman George had just directed because her name, he learned from Silas Henley while purchasing a second tin of coffee he did not need, was Annie Grayson. She was William Grayson's niece, and she had come all the way from St. Louis on the train to Wichita, and then by hired wagon to Caldwell to see what was left of her uncle's property, and to decide what to do with it. Silas Henley told George all of this because Silas Henley told everyone everything, and he told it now in the cheerful, gossiping tone of a man who considers community knowledge to be a public good. "Came in on her own," Silas said, wrapping up the coffee tin in a piece of brown paper that George had not asked for. "No husband that anyone's mentioned. Her uncle left the property to her, which is sensible enough since he had no children. Fine bit of land if she's willing to work it or find someone to work it. Good well, strong fence mostly." George paid for the coffee and left. He found himself, an hour later, standing outside the Grayson property, which was a quarter-mile south of the stockyards on a flat piece of Kansas land, with a cottonwood tree by the well and a small house that needed paint, and a fence that was indeed mostly strong, with 3 posts on the east side that had heeled over during the winter and not been set back. The gray wagon horse was in the small corral, and Annie Grayson was standing in the yard looking at the house with her hands on her hips and a look on her face that George had seen before. It was the look of someone assessing the honest weight of what they have taken on. He stood at the road and watched her for a moment, and then, because he was not a man who did things by halves once he had decided to do them, he dismounted, tied Cutter to the fence post, and walked across the yard toward her. She turned when she heard him coming, and there was a brief moment of recalibration in her expression, not alarm, but the adjustment a person makes when they are recalculating their circumstances. "You again," she said, and her tone was not unwelcoming. "Those fence posts need resetting," George said. He gestured at the east side. "Ground heaved in the freeze. Happens every winter if they're not set deep enough. Won't take more than half a day." She looked at the fence posts and then back at him. "Are you offering to fix them?" He was quiet for a moment. He was, in fact, not entirely sure what he was offering. He was standing in a woman's yard in a town he had intended to leave, pointing at her fence posts, and he had no good explanation for any of it. "I've got nothing else this week," he said, which was true. She considered him for a moment with an attention that was direct without being uncomfortable, the way someone looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. "I'm Annie Grayson," she said. "I can pay you for the work, though I should warn you I came to assess the situation before spending money freely, so I would want to know your rate before we agree to anything." "George Alden," he said it flat and without ornament. "You don't have to pay me. The posts bother me." She looked at him for another moment, and then, and he was not prepared for this, she laughed. It was a brief, genuine, surprised laugh, as if she had not expected to laugh and had not prevented it in time, and it changed her face in a way that George registered somewhere deep and physical, the way you register a change in the weather before you consciously identify what has changed. "All right, George Alden," she said. "There are tools in the small shed behind the house if you need them, and I'll make coffee when you're done if that's any inducement." "I'll find what I need," he said, and walked toward the shed. He spent the afternoon resetting the fence posts. It was work he knew how to do, digging out the heeled posts, tamping the earth properly, resetting the lumber at the right depth with the right angle so the next freeze would not do the same thing. He worked quietly and steadily, and Annie Grayson moved around the property with her own kind of industry, carrying things in and out of the house, sweeping the front step, investigating the well with the focused attention of someone making a list of what is and is not sound. She did not hover or chatter, and George found that he did not mind her presence in the way he usually minded people's presence. She existed at a comfortable distance, doing her own work, occasionally visible through the gap in the cottonwood branches, occasionally audible, a brief exchange with a neighbor woman who came to the fence to introduce herself, the knock of a door latch, the hollow sound of a bucket going down into the well. When the light started to go golden and long in the late afternoon way that Kansas light does in the spring, she appeared at the door of the house and called to him. "Coffee's on the stove. Come in when you're ready." He finished tamping the last post and came around to the front door. He left his hat on the hook just inside, an automatic habit from a childhood he had largely set aside, and stepped into the kitchen, which smelled of coffee and something else, something faintly sweet that he could not identify. She was standing at the stove, and the kitchen was in better order than he would have expected for a woman who had arrived that morning. She had unpacked her crate and her carpet bag, and there were familiar small things placed on the shelves, a blue pitcher, a small tin canister, a framed photograph, that made the space feel inhabited in a way that recently abandoned houses rarely did. She set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat down across from where she had placed his. He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it, and then he drank, and the coffee was good, strong, and not burned, which in his experience was a genuine achievement on an unfamiliar stove. "You do this kind of work regularly?" she asked. "Traveling from place to place?" "Yes." "Do you prefer it?" He looked up at her. It was an unexpected question. Most people, when they learned a man was a drifting ranch hand, assumed the preference or assumed its absence and did not ask. She was asking in genuine curiosity, without judgment, as if the answer were interesting rather than indicative of something. "It's what I know," he said. She nodded, accepting this without pressing it. "I worked in a telegraph office in St. Louis for 4 years, she said, as if offering something in return. "I know what it is to have a thing you do become the shape of your days. What made you leave?" The question came out before he decided to ask it, which was unusual for him, and he noticed this in a detached way, the way you notice the weather has changed again. She wrapped her own hands around her cup. "My uncle left me this property, and I had the choice of selling it without seeing it or coming to see what it was. I chose to see it." She paused. "I had been ready to leave St. Louis for a while. This gave me a reason to go." "You planning to stay?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've been here one afternoon. The well is good and the house is sound and the land is decent. I know enough about telegraph work to find a position in a town this size if there's need for it. Beyond that," she glanced out the window at the Kansas plain going amber and rose in the setting sun, "I have not decided." George drank his coffee and looked out the same window and said nothing, which was normal for him. What was not normal was that the silence felt, to him, comfortable. Not loaded, not requiring navigation, simply the ordinary quiet of 2 people in a room who did not need to fill all the space with words. When he had finished his coffee, he stood and put on his hat and said, "I'll be in town another day or 2 if anything else wants fixing." She looked up at him from the table, and there was that direct, unguarded quality again, that quality of actually seeing him as opposed to registering a general impression. "Thank you for the fence posts, George." He nodded and left. He lay in his bedroll that night in the room above Caldwell's only boarding house and looked at the ceiling and thought about the way she had said his name. Just his name. George. Not George Alden in the formal way, not Sir or Mr., just George, as if she had known him a while, as if he were a person with a name she had cause to remember. He had not said a kind word to anyone in 6 years, and he had never thought much about whether anyone had said a kind one to him, because he had not been listening for it. Now, having been the recipient of several small, genuine kindnesses in the space of one afternoon, he felt something creaking and protesting in him like a door that has been stuck closed for a long time, and is now being moved on its hinges for the first time in years. He did not sleep well. In the morning he went back. He told himself the well rope needed checking. And it did. He had noticed a fraying where it ran over the pulley, and that was his stated reason, and she accepted it without comment and pointed him toward the well and went back to sorting through her uncle's papers at the kitchen table. He replaced the rope. He looked at the house while he worked and saw that the shutters on the south side needed new hardware, and he made a note of it but did not mention it yet. He came in for coffee again when she called for it, and this time the conversation went longer. She asked him about the Kishom Trail, which she knew about from the telegraph traffic that had passed through her office in St. Louis, cattle prices and herd movements, and weather reports from the southern plains, and he found himself explaining things about the trail that he had not articulated to anyone in a very long time. Things about the way the land changed from Texas through the Indian Territory into Kansas, the particular quality of the wind in the territory, the way the longhorn cattle moved, and the logic of their behavior. She listened the way good listeners listen, which is to say she actually listened, her eyes on him, her attention present, and she asked questions at the moments when his answers naturally invited them. Not interrogating, not filling silence, just genuinely following the thread. He caught himself talking for nearly 10 minutes at one point, which was roughly 9.5 minutes more than he normally talked, and he stopped himself and looked at his coffee cup as if surprised to find himself here. "You know a great deal about it," she said, "and it was not flattery. She said it the way you say something is true because it is true. Spent enough time at it." "Where did you grow up?" she asked. There was a long pause. "Outside of Abilene." "Is your family still there?" "No." She heard the shape of that no. He could tell she heard it because she did not ask any more in that direction. She picked up her coffee cup and said, "I grew up in Ohio. My mother's people. I came west with my uncle when I was 16 and we settled in Kansas for a time before he moved further south and I eventually went east again for work." She looked out the window. "It's strange, coming back to a place that holds a piece of your history and finding it mostly the same but yourself entirely different." George looked at her. "How old are you?" 26, she said. "Is that a relevant question or a curious one?" "Curious," he said, which was the first time he had admitted to curiosity about anything in quite some time. She smiled at him, and there was something in that smile that was pleased, as if the admission of curiosity were evidence of something she had been wondering about. He left that afternoon and came back the next morning, and this time he did not have a stated reason at all. He simply rode up to the fence and tied Cutter and came to the door and knocked, and when she opened it he said, "The shutters on the south side need new hardware," which was true, and she said, "All right, come in and tell me what we need from the store," and he did. On the 5th day of this routine, Silas Henley made a comment when George came in for hardware supplies that consisted primarily of a knowing look and a smile that George did not dignify with a response. And on the 7th day, Ed Harper, the marshal, stopped him on the street and said, "You working for the Grayson woman?" And George said, "Some repairs," and Ed Harper, who was a perceptive man, said, "Uh-huh," in the tone of someone who has reached a conclusion. George ignored all of it. What he could not ignore was what was happening to him. Each morning he woke, and the first thing he thought about was what repair needed doing next at the Grayson property, and the second thing he thought about was Annie, and after a few days the order reversed, and the repair was the excuse rather than the reason, and he knew it, and it made him feel like a man standing at the edge of something very high, looking down, understanding both the fall and the impulse to step forward anyway. He was not accustomed to wanting things anymore. He had wanted things until 6 years ago, and then he had stopped, methodically and completely, because wanting things meant the possibility of losing them, and he had understood loss in the most absolute terms possible. He had structured his entire existence since then around not having things that could be taken. You could not take a cattle drive from a man. You could not take the ability to fix a fence. These things were useful and finite, and they did not put anything at risk. But Annie Grayson made him want things. She made him want to sit at her kitchen table and drink coffee until the light changed. She made him want to hear her talk about the telegraph wires and what came through them, the fragments of other people's lives condensed into 20 words or fewer. She made him want to make her laugh, that brief, genuine, surprised laugh that she produced when something caught her off guard. She made him want to be someone who deserved to have a name worth her saying. And the terror of all this wanting was very large, and he carried it around in his chest alongside the warmth of her kindnesses, and the two things sat together in him, and he had no framework for managing their coexistence. On the 9th day, something happened. Annie had received word through the land office that a man named Denton Crew, who ran one of the larger cattle operations south of Caldwell, was claiming that a strip of the Grayson property's eastern boundary overlapped with land he had purchased during the previous winter. The land office manager, a nervous man named Pitts, had delivered this news apologetically, and with the manner of someone who expected it to be unpleasant, which it was. The strip in question was about 60 feet wide and ran along the entire eastern side, and it included the fence George had just repaired. When Annie told George this, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the land documents spread out in front of her, and she was using the same composing herself voice she had used with the gray horse on the first day, which told George that she was genuinely troubled and managing it with effort. "Is Crew's claim legitimate?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "My uncle's deed is clear, but Pitts says Crew has a document from the winter that may create a conflict. I need to look at both documents together." She folded her hands on the table. "Do you know anything about Denton Crew?" George knew something about Denton Crew. He knew that Crew was the kind of man who acquired things by finding pressure points and applying force to them, usually legal force, though occasionally less formal kinds. He had heard of him from other hands who had worked in the area. He was not a violent man in the direct personal sense, but he had a lawyer in Wichita who he used the way other men used weapons. "He's persistent," George said carefully. Annie looked at him directly. "Is he dishonest?" "He finds ways to be honest that serve his purposes." She absorbed this. "Then I need to find a way to be honest that serves mine." She picked up her uncle's deed and examined it. "There is a man in Caldwell named Thomas Reeves who is said to be a fair advocate. I intend to see him tomorrow morning." George looked at the deed over her shoulder. He was not a lawyer, but he had been in enough land disputes on cattle operations to know how to read a deed, and what he could see from her uncle's document was that the eastern boundary line was described in terms of a natural landmark, a dry creek bed that had apparently shifted position during the heavy rains of the previous year. This was the ambiguity Crew's lawyer would exploit. "The creek moved," he said. "Yes, Pitts mentioned that. Your uncle's deed references the creek as it stood in 1878. If Crew's document describes the creek as it stood in December of last year, there's a real argument over which line controls." She looked up at him. "You know land law. I know land disputes. There's a difference." He sat down across from her. "You need someone to survey the original creek line from 1878. If there's any evidence of the old channel, and there usually is, the ground keeps the shape. A surveyor can document it and establish your uncle's original boundary regardless of where the water runs now." She stared at him for a moment with an expression he had not seen on her face before, which was something between relief and a kind of grateful astonishment, as if she had not expected the solution to present itself in this form and was genuinely moved that it had. "That is exactly the kind of thing I needed to know," she said, and her voice was warm and direct and fully meant. George looked down at the deed. "I'll ask around," he said. "There's a surveyor who works out of Wichita who comes through Caldwell every month or so. Someone at the land office will know when he's expected. George." She said his name the way she always said his name, simply, specifically, as if it were the right name for a particular person and she knew who that person was. "Why are you doing all of this?" He looked up from the deed. She was watching him with a quiet attention that asked the question seriously and deserved a serious answer. He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally, which was not the whole truth but was not a lie either. She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded, as if this were enough for now, as if she could wait for the rest. He found the surveyor, a methodical, serious man named Halbert who came through Caldwell 2 weeks later, and he brought him out to the Grayson property and walked the eastern boundary with him, while Annie followed behind, and watched Halbert take his measurements with the quiet, concentrated patience of a woman who has decided to trust a process and is seeing it through. Halbert found the ghost of the old creek channel within 2 hours, the slight depression in the ground, the particular composition of the soil, the pattern of the cottonwood roots that had grown toward old water, and he documented it in terms that Annie's advocate Thomas Reeves said were legally sufficient. Denton Crew's lawyer in Wichita, when presented with Halbert's survey and Reeves's brief, withdrew the competing claim without going to court. Annie told George this on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, standing in her front yard in the clear, warm light that Kansas generates after a cold spring, and she was smiling the free and genuine smile of someone who has won a fair fight. "It's done," she said. "Reeves sent word this morning." Crew's lawyer withdrew. George was repairing the step on her front porch, which had been soft and needed new planking, and he looked up from the work. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed, and the word between them was simple and warm and shared. And George Alden, for the first time in 6 years, felt something inside him that he recognized after a long moment as happiness, small and tentative but unmistakably present. The way a fire feels when it has been started from cold wood and is just beginning to catch. He looked down at the step plank and drove a nail and said nothing else, because he did not need to, and because the feeling was new enough that talking seemed like it might disturb it. She sat down on the edge of the porch above him, which put her close to where he was working, and she said, "Tell me something about yourself." "Something that isn't about fixing things." He drove another nail. "I'm not good at that," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm asking anyway." He set the hammer down and sat back on his heels and looked out at the yard and the cottonwood and the open Kansas sky beyond the fence. He thought about what he might say that was true and that he could say. "I used to read," he said finally. She was quiet, waiting. "When I was younger, before for a while, I used to read in the evenings, whatever I could find." He paused. "I haven't in a long time. What did you read?" "Whatever was available, history mostly, some novels." "I read the same copy of Dickens 3 times one winter in Colorado because it was the only book in the bunkhouse." She turned her head slightly, and he could see in his peripheral vision that she was smiling. "Which Dickens?" "A Tale of Two Cities." "That is a difficult book to be stuck with alone in a Colorado winter." "It passed the time," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost a smile, which was not entirely unprecedented but was genuinely rare. "I have books," she said. "My uncle had several and I brought some from St. Louis. You are welcome to borrow any of them." He looked up at her then. She was sitting in the afternoon light with her hands in her lap and her face open and her eyes the kind of warm brown that held both intelligence and something deeper, something patient and genuine. And George Alden looked at her and understood with a completeness that he had not yet allowed himself until this moment that he was in love with her. The understanding came all at once, the way things you have been half knowing for some time arrive when you stop preventing them, and it hit him somewhere in the center of his chest with a force that was almost physical, and he looked away quickly, back at the step planking, and picked up the hammer again. He did not know what to do with it. He was a man who had chosen not to love anyone for 6 years, and he had been good at that choice. And now here he was with his chest full of something warm and terrifying and specifically shaped like Annie Grayson, and he had absolutely no idea what to do next. He drove 3 more nails and then he said, "I'll take you up on the Dickens if you have something else." "I have Great Expectations," she said, "and a few others." "That would be fine," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt, which was the sole advantage of 6 years of emotional distance. It gave you excellent control over your voice. He went home that night with a copy of Great Expectations and read the first 2 chapters lying on his boarding house bed, and then set the book face down on his chest and looked at the ceiling for a very long time. He had been in Caldwell for 3 weeks. He had intended to stay 3 days. He went back to see Annie the next morning and the morning after that, and he began to notice that she watched for him. Not obviously, not with any desperation, but in the manner of someone who has gotten used to a particular good thing and finds themselves paying a small, quiet attention to whether it is coming. When he tied Cutter at the fence, she was usually visible within a few seconds at the window or the door, not hurrying, just present, which told him that she heard the horse and came to look. He thought about that a great deal. One evening in early May, toward the end of the week, they sat on the front porch after the day's work. He had been helping her prepare a kitchen garden in the space behind the house, turning the soil and building a frame for climbing beans. And she had brought out 2 cups of coffee, and they sat in the chairs on the porch. And the sun went down over the Kansas plain in a slow, magnificent wash of color, the kind of sunset that the West produces with a generosity that seems personal. George sat with his coffee and his hands and his thoughts, and the silence was comfortable in the way it had become comfortable between them, and after a while she said quietly, "You've been here almost a month." "Yes." "Are you thinking of moving on?" He looked at the sunset. He thought about what to say. He thought about the question behind the question, which was a genuine question and which deserved an honest answer. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am not asking you to stay," she said carefully. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you for anything. She paused, and he could hear that she was picking her words honestly. "I would like to know where I stand. If that's a reasonable thing to ask." George set his coffee cup down on the porch rail and looked at his hands. He looked at the far edge of the horizon where the last of the color was going. He thought about 6 years of moving and the specific weight of moving and the specific, frightening weight of what was happening inside him right now, which was something he had not felt in 6 years and which was in every way more complicated than moving and in every way more alive. "Annie," he said. "Yes." He turned and looked at her. She was watching him with that direct, patient, unclosing attention that was so specifically her and that he had come to value in a way that was difficult to articulate. "I lost someone," he said. 6 years ago. I haven't." He stopped. He tried again. "I've been a long time not letting myself want anything that could be lost." She looked at him steadily, and there was no pity in her face, which he was grateful for, only that patient attention and a warmth that did not require anything from him. "I know," she said quietly. "I suspected something like that." "That's not an excuse," he said. "It's an explanation. There's a difference." "I know that too," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. The last of the sunset light touched the side of her face, and he looked at it and felt the full, undeniable weight of everything he wanted. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and it was the most honest thing he had said to another person in 6 years. Possibly the most honest thing he had ever said, because it was not a complaint or a deflection but a plain statement of truth. "I've forgotten how to be in the same place twice. How to have conversations that continue from one day to the next. I don't know how to." He shook his head. "I'm not good at this." "I know that too," she said for the 3rd time, and the way she said it was so gentle and so complete that something in George's chest cracked open very quietly. "But you're still sitting there," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the evening settled around them soft and warm, and the first stars were coming out over the Kansas plain, and George Alden reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, which was right there, and which she let him take, and he held it and looked at it, her hand in both of his. And the warmth of it was the most frightening and most welcome thing he had touched in 6 years. "I'm not good at this," he said again. "That's all right," she said. "Neither am I in my own ways. We can be bad at it together and see what happens." He looked at her then with the full, unguarded attention that he had been rationing for 6 years, and she looked back at him the same way, and George Alden, who had not said a kind word to anyone in 6 years, found himself saying, quietly and without premeditation, "I'm glad you came around that corner too fast and nearly turned over your wagon." She laughed that brief, genuine, surprised laugh, and did not let go of his hand. The weeks that followed were, in the honest accounting of George Alden's internal experience, both the most wonderful and the most difficult of his adult life. Not difficult in the way that cattle drives and river crossings were difficult, which was physical and external and could be managed with competence and endurance. Difficult in the way that opening something long closed is difficult, the resistance of the hinges, the unfamiliarity of the light coming in, the vulnerability of whatever was on the inside now being visible. He stayed in Caldwell. He found work at one of the nearby cattle operations, a solid outfit run by a man named Ben Collier who needed a reliable hand and did not ask excessive questions. And he kept coming to Annie's property on the evenings and weekends, and they fell into the kind of rhythm that is not made by planning, but by the accumulation of shared mornings and evenings and meals and conversations, and the specific comfort of another person's consistent presence. He learned things about her that he turned over in his mind the way a person turns over something interesting and well-made. He learned that she had a very precise sense of humor that was entirely dry and that operated by the presentation of plain facts in slightly unexpected order, and that once you understood how it worked it was very funny. He learned that she was genuinely fearless about the practical difficulties of life on the frontier, the hard work, the uncertain weather, the supply problems, the social roughness of a cattle town, but that she was tender about small things, about the yellow dog that had adopted her front step, about the patch of wild columbine that had come up along the south fence in May and that she watered carefully. He learned that she had been engaged once in St. Louis to a man who had left for the East with ambitions that did not include a woman who worked in a telegraph office and intended to stay one, and that she had been hurt by it but had arrived at a clear-eyed understanding of the incompatibility and had not spent herself on bitterness about it. He learned, in short, who she was, and who she was made everything he felt about her more rather than less. She learned things about him, too, because he was, slowly and by degrees, learning to tell her things. He told her about Clara, one evening in June, sitting at the kitchen table after supper. He had begun staying for supper on certain evenings, which felt significant and which both of them recognized as significant without labeling it. He told it plainly and without dramatizing it, and she listened without interrupting or filling the gaps with sympathy. And when he had finished, she sat for a moment and then said, "She sounds like she was someone who deserved to be loved the way you loved her. And you deserve to have her." And something about the way she said that, acknowledging the reality of Clara, acknowledging what George had lost, without flinching from it or trying to diminish it, undid something in him that had been wound tight for a very long time. He looked at the table and did not speak for a moment. When he looked up, she was watching him with those warm brown eyes, steady and present, and he said, "Thank you." And it was the fullest and most heavily loaded thank you he had ever said, carrying in it 6 years of unspoken things. "You don't have to thank me for the truth," she said. "In July, there was a difficulty. Denton Crew, having lost the land dispute in April, had not entirely set aside his interest in the Grayson property. He had apparently engaged a new representative. Not a lawyer this time, but a local man named Curtis Webb who worked as his foreman, and who had a manner that was somewhere between persuasion and threat. And Webb had appeared at Annie's front door on a Wednesday morning, when George was at work for Collier, and presented what he called an offer to purchase the property at a number that was well below its value, but was presented in the kind of steady, certain tone designed to make alternatives seem unavailable. Annie had told him she would consider the offer and close the door, and then she had driven to Collier's operation and asked one of the other hands to find George and tell him she needed to speak with him. When George came, She told him the whole of it while standing in her kitchen with her arms folded, not because she was frightened, but because she was angry, and the anger had a very specific quality. It was the anger of someone who is being treated as less capable than they are and resents the condescension. George listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You don't want to sell?" "No," she said, "I do not. I have a garden that is producing well and a good well and a house that is in decent condition and a town that I am beginning to know, and I have no intention of selling at any price because this is my uncle's land and I intend to keep it." George looked at her and felt, alongside the concern about Crewe's methods, a very clear and clean admiration for the straightforwardness of her position. "Then you won't sell," he said. Webb made it sound as though Crewe doesn't always take no for an answer. "Crewe isn't going to bother you," George said, and there was something in the way he said it, not a threat, not posturing, simply the calm certainty of a man stating a fact that made Annie look at him for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Talk to Ed Harper," he said, "and then go see Webb." He went to Ed Harper first and told him what had happened, and Harper, who knew Crewe and knew Webb and had a clear sense of what Crewe's acquisition methods looked like, said he would make it his business to pay a visit to Denton Crewe himself and make certain the man understood that Caldwell's marshal considered unsolicited pressure on landowners to be a matter worth his attention. Harper was fair and methodical, and the word of the law in this county, and Crewe, for all his acquisitiveness, was not stupid enough to cross Ed Harper directly. George went to see Webb himself afterward, which was a brief conversation that consisted of George explaining, in very plain terms and without raising his voice, that Annie Grayson was not selling her property, and that any future approaches of the sort Webb had made that morning should be redirected to her advocate Thomas Reeves, and that George personally would take a strong interest in any alternative approaches. Webb was not a small man, but he looked at George with the consideration of someone doing a very clear-eyed calculation, and he nodded, and the conversation ended there. Crewe sent no more representatives. When George told Annie what had happened, she was standing in the garden checking the bean frame, and she straightened and looked at him with an expression that had in it both relief and something else, something deeper and more personal. "You did not have to do that," she said. "No," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she walked the few steps between them and put her hand flat against his chest, which no person had done since Clara, and which George received with the full force of 6 years of accumulated distance and the undeniable end of it. And he covered her hand with his and stood there in the July garden and felt the warm, impossible reality of her hand against his heart. "George," she said softly. "I know," he said. "Do you?" she asked, looking up at him. "Yes," he said, "I do." He kissed her then, there in the bean garden with the cottonwood throwing dappled shade, and the sound of the cattle far off, and the whole Kansas summer broad and golden around them. And it was the first kiss he had given or received in 6 years, and it was gentle and honest, and carried the full weight of everything that had led to it. And when it ended, she kept her hand on his chest, and he kept his hand over hers, and neither of them moved for a moment. "I love you," she said, without preface and without qualification, in the same direct and honest way she said everything, as if it were simply true and worth saying. George Alden stood in the garden and felt the words land in him, and felt the old fear rise up alongside them, and looked at her face, and let the fear be there without letting it govern, which was new, and said, "I love you too," and meant it with everything he was. And it cost him something to say, and it also gave him something, which was the nature of real things. She smiled, and it was not the brief surprised laugh this time, but something fuller and quieter, and she leaned her forehead briefly against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the garden and were, both of them, thoroughly and genuinely happy. The rest of the summer passed in the warm, accumulating way that happy summers do. George worked at Collier's during the week and spent his evenings and his free days at Annie's place, and the work he did there gradually shifted in character from repairs to improvements. A new shed roof, a proper woodpile, a better arrangement for the kitchen garden, the work of someone who is not building for maintenance but for permanence. Annie noticed this shift and did not comment on it directly, but her manner toward him carried an easy warmth and comfort that told him she understood it. In August, Ben Collier offered George a permanent position as foreman of the Collier operation, which was a step up from hand and carried a wage that was real and sustainable, and George accepted it after thinking about it for one day, which was much faster than his usual decision-making, and he told Annie that evening over supper. She looked at him with those warm eyes and said, "Is that the kind of work you want?" "It's the kind of life I want," he said carefully. "The work fits it." She understood what he meant and said, "How long has it been since you had a life rather than a series of jobs?" He thought about it honestly. 6 years, he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers briefly, and he turned his hand under hers and held it, and she looked at him and said, "I think you've been a long time out in the cold." "Yes," he said. "Come in then," she said. In September, on a clear, cool morning when the Kansas sky had gone that deep autumn blue that looks close enough to touch, George rode out to Annie's property early, before she was expecting him, and he had in his pocket a piece of paper on which he had written, very carefully, the words he intended to say, because he had written them out 3 times the previous night to make sure they were honest and right and sufficient. He knocked at the door and she opened it with the easy surprise of someone genuinely glad to see him, and he took the paper out of his pocket and looked at it for a moment and then put it back, because in the event he did not need it. "Annie," he said. "Yes." She saw something in his face and went still with a kind of soft attention. "I know I have been a long time getting to where I know how to say things properly," he said. "I'm not going to be a man who is good at speeches. I'm not going to be someone who finds it easy to say what's inside him, but I want to be here. I want to be here for the rest of it, the fence posts and the garden and the good coffee and the hard winters and whatever comes after. I want to be in the same place as you and have it be the right place." He looked at her steadily. "Will you marry me?" Annie Grayson looked at George Alden standing at her door on a September morning in 1882, with the autumn Kansas sky behind him and his hat in his hands, and his face as honest and open as she had ever seen it. And she said, "Yes," immediately and without any hesitation at all. He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for quite a while. "Good," he said, and she laughed the surprised laugh and reached out and took hold of the front of his shirt and pulled him inside. They were married in October, in the small church with the recently repaired roof. George had quietly arranged for the repair as a contribution, which the congregation had accepted gratefully, in a ceremony performed by a minister named Elias Croft, who had a good voice and a genuine belief in what he was saying. Ed Harper was there, and Ben Collier, and his wife Martha, and Silas Henley, and his wife, and several other people from Caldwell who had, in the way of small towns, followed the whole progression of George and Annie with the invested attention of people who had been hoping for this outcome. Annie wore a dress of deep blue wool, which was a practical choice for October and also happened to look extraordinary on her, and George wore a good coat that he had purchased in Wichita the previous week, and his cleanest shirt, and the look on his face when she walked to him in the church was not easily described. But Ed Harper, who was watching, said afterward to his wife that he had never seen a man look at something the way George Alden looked at Annie Grayson. Like he was looking at the one true fixed point after a very long time of having none. George took Annie's hand when she came to stand beside him, and he held it with the steadiness of a man who has no intention of letting go. And when Elias Croft asked the necessary questions, he answered them with his eyes on Annie's face, and she answered hers with her eyes on his. And it was a very ordinary frontier wedding in a small church in a cattle town in Kansas in 1882, and it was also completely, irreducibly extraordinary. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at Ben Collier's home. Martha Collier had insisted on providing the celebration, which she produced with impressive organizational efficiency. And there was food and music, and the particular warmth of a community that is genuinely pleased about something. And George stood with Annie's hand in his, and said more words to more people in a single afternoon than he had said in any given week of the previous 6 years. And it was strange, and it was fine, and it was, he found to his considerable surprise, good. He had not said a kind word to anyone in 6 years, and now he was saying them, not floridly or with effort, but in the ordinary course of standing beside the woman he loved among people who wished them well, saying thank you and yes, and that's very kind and I appreciate it, and these were small words, but they were genuinely meant, and the meaning of them, the practice of meaning them, was something he had not had the use of for a long time and was now finding his way back to. Annie watched him through the afternoon with a quiet attention that was also satisfaction, not satisfaction at changing him. She had not set out to change him, and she understood the distinction, but satisfaction at witnessing the change, at being present for the slow and real reopening of a person she loved. They moved into the Grayson house that autumn, which became, by the natural adjustment of two people building a life together, simply their house. George brought his few possessions from the boarding house, which took one trip, and Annie arranged things with the eye of a woman who has thought carefully about how a space should live. And the house, which had been her uncle's and then hers, became something that belonged to both of them and felt like it. The first winter was cold, as Kansas winters are, and they were snowed in for 3 days in January, which George spent cutting and splitting a season's worth of wood that he had been meaning to get to anyway, and Annie spent reading and baking with the focused creativity of a woman who treats confinement as an opportunity. And the 3 days had in them the particular quality of time spent with someone you choose to be with in a small space, and discover that the choosing holds. George woke before dawn most mornings by habit and made coffee and stoked the fire, and Annie woke when the coffee was ready and came to the kitchen, and they sat in the early dark with their cups and talked, or did not talk, equally comfortable in both states, and these mornings became the texture of their days, the thing that George, if he thought about it, would identify as the center of his life, the anchor point around which everything else organized itself. He had not understood, in the years of moving, how much of himself had been unmade by the absence of exactly this kind of anchorage. He had thought of himself as essentially intact, as a man who was functioning, which he had been, but functioning is not the same as living, and the distinction had become very clear to him over the course of this year in a way that was sometimes overwhelming in its simplicity. In the spring of 1883, Annie told him she was pregnant. She told him on an evening in April, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the careful, direct manner she used for important things, and she watched his face when she told him. George sat very still for a moment. He looked at his hands. He thought about the last time he had received news like this, and the particular way that news had ended, and he felt the old grief stir in him. Not gone. It was never entirely gone, but no longer the whole of him. He looked up at Annie. She was watching him steadily, and in her face he could see that she knew what he was thinking about, because she knew him well enough now to know where his mind went when he went quiet, and she was giving him the space to be there and come back. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "Are you well?" he asked first. "Yes," she said. "Everything is fine." He held her hands and looked at her and felt something cresting in him that was made of fear and hope and love, and the simple staggering fact of continuation, of life extending forward instead of stopping, and his eyes were bright with it in a way he could not prevent and did not try to. "I'm glad," he said, which was inadequate by a very long measure but was the best he could do, and she squeezed his hands and said, "So am I." And they sat there together in the kitchen with the spring evening coming through the window and the whole enormous future laid out ahead of them. He was terrified, that spring and summer. He acknowledged this to Annie directly and without embarrassment, which 6 months earlier would not have been possible for him, and which now felt necessary and right. He told her about the fear, the specific shape of it, the memory of what loss had looked like. And she listened and did not dismiss it and did not try to argue him out of it. But she also, calmly and repeatedly, showed him the present reality, which was that she was strong and healthy and practical, and that they were in a town with a doctor and a midwife, and everything that could be managed was being managed. He built a cradle in June, in the shed behind the house, working in the evenings with a careful precision that went beyond simple carpentry. He chose the wood maple, from a piece he had been holding back from the woodpile for no reason he had at the time been able to articulate, and he worked it over several weeks, joining it with a patience that was very deliberate, smoothing it with a thoroughness that was essentially meditative, putting into it the full weight of what it was for and what he hoped for it. Annie came out to look at it when it was finished and stood in the shed doorway with her hand on the frame and said, simply, "George, it's beautiful." He looked at it and then at her. "It'll hold," he said, and meant more than wood and joints. Their son was born in November of 1883, delivered by Caldwell's midwife, a capable and unhurried woman named Pearl Watts, on a cold evening when the fire was high, and the lamp was good and George was present for the whole of it, which was not the common practice among men of that time and place, but which he had insisted on, and which Annie had wanted. It was the longest and most difficult evening of George Alden's life, and it was also the best. The baby arrived, eventually and noisily, and Pearl Watts set him in George's arms while she continued her work, and George stood by the window with his son and felt the specific weight of him, small and solid and impossibly real, and could not speak for a considerable time. Annie, pale and exhausted and radiant in the specific way of women who have just done something enormous and survived it, watched him from the bed with the most complete and contented expression he had ever seen on a human face. "Well," she said. George looked at her. He looked at the baby. "He needs a name," he said. "He does," she agreed. "I thought William for my uncle. What do you think?" "William," George said, trying the name with the weight of the boy in his arms. "William Alden." "Yes," said Annie. George looked at his son, and then at his wife, and the fire crackled in the grate, and the Kansas wind moved against the window glass, and he held the boy, and the world was very large and very close at once, and everything that had been lost 6 years ago was not replaced. Nothing replaces what is lost, but it existed now alongside something new and real and living. And the coexistence of grief and love and hope was not a contradiction, but simply the truth of what it was to be a person who had kept going. William grew into a sturdy, curious child with Annie's dark eyes and George's build, and a disposition that was fundamentally cheerful in a way that seemed to belong entirely to himself. He was interested in everything, in the horses and the cattle and the tools in the shed and the books on the shelf, and the stories his parents told him in the evenings. And he was, from very early on, an excellent companion to both his parents in their different ways. George, who had spent 6 years in the company of other people's indifference, found in his son a kind of joy that was new to him in its quality. He was patient with William in a way that surprised even himself, spending time explaining things that a man in a hurry would not explain, finding a pleasure in the boy's understanding that was different from any satisfaction he had known in work. Annie watched this and said nothing about it, but there was a look in her face when she watched them together that was deep and quiet and entirely happy. They added to the Grayson house in the spring of 1885, a new room off the east side, which George framed and built over the course of a spring and summer with help from Ben Collier's hands, and from a few other men in Caldwell who had, over the 2.5 years of George and Annie's marriage, come to consider George Alden the kind of man you helped when he was building something because the chance to do it did not come around so often. George had become, gradually and without dramatic announcement, a man of the town. Not in the political or prominent sense. He had no appetite for office or for being a figure, but in the simple sense of being someone who was known and who knew people, who had a place in the ordinary fabric of daily life in Caldwell. He still worked for Ben Collier, managing the foreman work with the competent, direct manner that made things run, and he was known as reliable and fair, which are exactly the two things that matter most in a foreman and in the general run of life. He said kind words now. Not excessively, not with any performance, but genuinely and as the occasion called for them. And people who had known him in the early days of his arrival in Caldwell Silas Henley, Ed Harper, Ben Collier recognized the change and found it satisfying in the quiet way that real changes in real people are satisfying, which is without surprise and with a sense of things having arrived at where they were going. The second child came in the summer of 1886, a girl, born in July in the middle of a heat so pure and flat that the air itself seemed to hold its breath, and her arrival was considerably less frightening than William's had been, not because George had become complacent, but because he had learned, in the 3 years between them, that fear and hope are not enemies but companions, and that the only answer to both is to be present and to love what you have while you have it. They named her Clara, which was Annie's idea, suggested carefully and offered to George without pressure, and he had sat with it for one evening and then said yes. And when he said it, his voice was steady and his face was at peace in a way that showed Annie that the name was not a wound but a continuance, a way of carrying something forward rather than leaving it behind. Clara Alden had red hair, which surprised everyone and produced considerable cheerful speculation in Caldwell about its origin, and she was from the beginning a person of strong opinion and impressive volume, and an absolute certainty about her place in the world that was extremely entertaining to observe. George, who had once been a man who could not say a kind word to anyone, found himself saying them constantly now, to his children, to his wife, to the hands at Collier's, to Silas Henley across the dry goods counter, to the neighbor who needed help with a well and the farmer who needed a fence ridden. The kindness was not soft. It was direct and without embellishment in the way that George did everything, but it was genuine and it was extended freely, and the absence of it, those 6 years of closed distance, had become something he could look at clearly now, the way you can look at a storm from the far side of it once you are through. There were evenings, even in the fullness of this good life, when the grief came up, when he lay awake and the wind sounded a particular way and he thought of Clara, the first Clara, and what had been lost, and the weight of it was still real. Annie knew when these evenings came because she had learned to read him with a precision that still occasionally astonished him. The slight stiffness, the quality of his silence, and she would simply be there, close, her hand finding his in the dark, not speaking unless he needed speech, just present in the way that was her particular gift, that absolute, unconditional presence. He told her once in one of these late evenings, "I don't know how you do that, know when to be quiet and when to speak." She considered this for a moment. "I had a lot of practice being patient," she said, "with people, with telegraph messages, with difficult situations. I learned that most things reveal themselves if you give them enough quiet." "Most things," he said. "You," she specified, with the dry precision that was her humor, and he laughed, which was another thing he did more often now than he had imagined possible when he rode into Caldwell in the spring of 1882, intending to buy supplies and leave. William started school in the fall of 1888, at the small school that Caldwell had established in a proper schoolhouse building, taught by a young woman named Miss Hart, who was quietly overwhelmed by her responsibilities and quietly excellent at them. George walked William to the school on his first day and stood at the fence watching the boy disappear inside with the measured solemnity of someone doing something enormous, and then rode to work. He thought about it all day, the way parents do, and when he came home that evening William was at the table with Annie's help doing the letters from his first lesson, and his face was so full of effort and concentration and satisfaction that George had to set down his hat carefully and turn away for a moment before he trusted his face to be ordinary. "He did very well," Annie said from the stove, and in her voice was the quiet fullness of a woman who was watching her husband feel something and finding it beautiful. George came to the table and sat beside William and looked at the letters. "Good," he said to his son, in the plain, direct way he said things, and William looked up at him with Annie's dark eyes and said, "Pa, can you show me the letter G? Miss Hart showed me, but I want to see how you do it." And George picked up the pencil and made a careful, deliberate G on the paper beside his son's, and William studied it with the focused attention of someone learning something important. In 1889, Kansas was changing around them. The cattle trade was shifting. The great trail drives that had defined Caldwell's economy for over a decade were slowing as the railroad networks expanded, and the open range was giving way to fenced homestead land. Caldwell itself was adapting, as frontier towns either adapted or diminished, filling in its rougher edges and adding the institutional structures of a town that intended to persist. Ben Collier talked to George about the changing landscape and what it meant for the operation, and George had thought carefully about it over several evenings at the kitchen table, sometimes with Annie, who had a clear analytical mind and a habit of getting to the center of a problem quickly, and sometimes alone, working it out in the way he had always worked out difficult things, quietly and thoroughly. He told Annie one evening in March that he thought it was time to consider whether to stay with Collier's operation long-term or whether to think about their own land. The Grayson property was theirs and it was fine, but it was not a working ranch, and if the cattle trade was shifting towards smaller, more established operations rather than the great trail drives, there might be an opportunity. Annie listened to all of this and then said, "What do you want?" He looked at her across the table. It was the same question she had asked him long ago about the work, and it still carried the same quality of genuine interest, the same refusal to answer for him. "I want land that's ours," he said. "Something we build, something William can have a part in when he's old enough if he wants it." "Then that's what we should work toward," she said, and they did. Over the next 2 years, George worked Collier's operation and saved carefully, and Annie, who had gone back to a part-time position at the Caldwell telegraph office when William started school, contributed her wages, and they looked at land and talked to other ranchers, and did the slow, careful arithmetic of people building something real on a modest foundation. In the summer of 1891, they purchased 40 acres of good grass land 4 miles east of Caldwell, with a creek that was their own, documented and surveyed, and bearing absolutely no ambiguity about its boundaries, and a stand of cottonwoods and enough room to start small and grow, which was exactly what they intended. George built the house himself, with help from men he had earned the friendship of over 9 years of living and working in the county, and Annie chose every detail of the interior with the combination of practicality and care that characterized everything she did. And when it was done, it was a real house, solid and well-made, with a porch that looked east over the grass and a kitchen with good light, and a room for William and a room for Clara, and a room for the two of them with a window that caught the morning sun. They moved in the fall of 1891, and on the first evening in the new house, after the children were in their beds, George and Annie sat on the new porch in the cool September dark and looked out over their land. George sat with his hands around a cup of coffee and looked at the dark grass and the stars, and felt the thing that he had been building, carefully and over many years, fully around him and fully real, the land and the house and the sleeping children inside, and the woman beside him who had said one kind word to a man with a closed heart and had not given up on what she saw in him. "Annie," he said. She was looking at the stars with a peaceful, unhurried face. "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I said I was sorry for the commotion," she said. "That is what I remember first." "You said thank you," he said. "When I pointed you toward the lot, you said it was genuinely helpful." She turned and looked at him in the dark. "I meant it." "I know," he said. "That was the trouble." She looked at him with a questioning tilt. "I didn't know what to do with it," he said. "You meant it. You said something kind and you meant it, and I had no idea what to do with that. I'd been a long time without it. He paused. I sat on my horse 400 yards out of town thinking about it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said softly, "And then you came back." "And then I came back," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he held hers, and they sat on the porch of their house on their land under the enormous Kansas sky, and the grass moved in the night wind, and the stars were very many and very clear, and George Alden was here, entirely here, in the only place he wanted to be, in the company of the woman he loved, and the 6 years of closed distance and moved on, and nothing that could be lost were behind him like the weather behind a hill, still real. Still part of the landscape, but no longer the sky above him. He had found his way back from the far edge of himself, one fence post and one cup of coffee and one honest conversation at a time, and the road back had been Annie Grayson saying his name in a plain and specific way, and meaning what she said when she said it, and sitting in a porch chair and waiting with a patience that was not passivity but love. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The September wind moved the grass, and the horses were quiet in the new corral, and somewhere in the house William turned in his sleep and Clara made a sound of total contentment, and the night was deep and wide and entirely good. In the years after, the Alden ranch grew steadily, as honest work and steady purpose allowed, not spectacularly but durably, in the way of things built on good foundations. They ran cattle on the east pasture and grew a kitchen garden that expanded every spring, and Annie kept the telegraph position in town 3 days a week, because she was genuinely good at it, and because she had always been a woman who liked to have useful work in the world beyond her household, which George had always understood and respected and never questioned. William, by the time he was 12, could ride and rope and read the weather signs and follow the logic of land management with the absorbed attention of a boy who was genuinely interested in what he was learning, and George taught him with the same patient directness with which he approached everything, talking through the reasoning, not just the practice. Clara, who was 8 and considerably less interested in cattle management than her brother, was deeply interested in the horses, and George spent Saturday mornings teaching her to handle them in the specific way he had always handled them, with attention and firmness, and a respect for what the animal was. Annie watched her husband with their children and felt, reliably, the settled fullness that had been her private ambition since the day she arrived in Caldwell, and looked at a man who had nothing kind left in him and thought, with the instinctive clarity that she trusted, "There is something here that wants to come back." She had not fixed him. She did not think of it that way, and she would have pushed back firmly on anyone who framed it that way. He had fixed himself. He had made the choices, one at a time, to turn toward rather than away, to accept rather than refuse, to stay rather than move on. She had simply been the reason worth turning toward, and she had been honest and consistent and patient, and she had said his name the way a person deserves to have their name said, and she had meant it. That was all she had done, and it had been exactly enough. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in October of 1892, George took Annie out to the east side of the property, where the cottonwood stand was thickest, and the creek ran clear and wide, and they walked along the water in the late afternoon light, just the two of them, William having been charged with watching his sister for the evening, and doing it with the responsible air of an almost 9-year-old taking a serious commission very seriously. They walked along the creek, and George told her, in his plain and deliberate way, all the things he had never been able to say at the beginning and that had accumulated over 10 years into a considerable sum. What she had meant to him, and what their life together had meant, what William and Clara meant, what the land meant, what it was to be a man who had a home to ride toward at the end of the day instead of simply away from the last thing. He was not flowery about it. He used plain words, and he said what he meant, and Annie listened to all of it with her hand in his and her face calm and warm and present in the specific way that was her, and that he had been grateful for every day for 10 years. When he finished, she turned and looked at him and said, 10 years ago you couldn't tell me your name without making it sound like the end of a conversation. George Alden, he said, in his flattest voice, a perfect reproduction of the way he had said it the first day. She laughed, the surprised laugh, and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood by the creek in the October light while the water ran clear and bright over the smooth stones, and the cottonwoods made their sound in the wind, that particular rushing, papery sound of cottonwood leaves in autumn that George had always associated with the Kansas plains, and that he now associated with home. He had not said a kind word to anyone in 6 years, and then Annie Grayson had said one to him, and he had not known how to carry it, and he had carried it anyway, all the way back through the closed door of himself and out the other side, into a life he had not imagined possible on the morning he rode into Caldwell with nothing but a list of supplies and the long, habitual purpose of moving on. He was done moving on. He was here. He held his wife by their creek on their land under their sky, and the evening came down gold and wide and complete, and everything that had been lost was honored in the living of this, and everything that had been given by Annie's simple, unguarded kindness, by his own willingness, finally, to receive it, was laid out before them in the shape of all the good days still to come. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the creek ran on, and the light held for a long golden moment before the dark came slowly in, and George Alden, who had once been a man riding out of town in the wrong direction from everything he needed, was entirely and irreversibly home.